Hello there, this is Mystery US History, and this is Andrew Jackson, our seventh president. He is a very controversial president, and many people regard him as the worst president, and some people regard him as one of the best presidents. And let's first take a look at what Jackson brought to the country. First of all, it was because of Jackson that we expanded as far as we really did. Now, really, it was Jefferson who got us the land to begin with. And under Jackson's presidency, we didn't really gain that many territories. But it was because of Jackson that prominent people like James K. Polk were able to expand the United States so far. Not to mention the fact that it was because Andrew Jackson he had inspired many white males to show up and vote on elections. Not to mention, so he basically encouraged democratic participation from only white males, of course. And not to mention the fact that Jackson and his supporters had hated the National Bank and had brought its removal. Not to mention the fact that Jackson, for a brief period of time, we actually had no national debt at all. And Jackson also brought about the spoils system, in which a patronage worked, and basically the system where people get appointed to government because of their political party rather than their merits was started under Jackson. Also, Jackson had favored a strict interpretation of the United States Constitution. And let's just say Andrew Jackson was never elected president. How would the history and how would our country change? Well, there would be numerous changes. Would we have gotten all the territory we did by the 1860s without Andrew Jackson? Would we have still removed Native American tribes from the South without Andrew Jackson? Would the Civil War have even happened in the first place? Because most of the conflicts that led up to the Civil War, which were the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, were a direct cause of our expansion. So, in this alternate timeline, the election of 1824 happens. It ends up the same way. John Quincy Adams, it's dead heat between the candidates, though Andrew Jackson has the most electoral votes, and Henry Clay is eliminated, although he can still choose who the president is because of his power as Speaker of the House, and the House decides the presidency. So there were three people who advanced, which were James Crawford, Andrew Jackson, and John Quincy Adams. Right away, Clay did not want to choose Crawford because Crawford was very sickly and old, and Clay didn't like Jackson. He thought him too unstable for the role of president, and that left John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams shared many of Henry Clay's views, and both of them had supported a more involved federal government, and they had supported the use of revenue collected from the federal government to make internal improvements and build and use the money for projects such as infrastructure. And Adams then made one of the biggest mistakes in his entire political career, which was choosing Henry Clay as Secretary of State. This made it look like there was a corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, in which Henry Clay secured Adams' election on the condition that Adams would appoint him as Secretary of State. This was also bad because Secretary of State at the time was seen as a stepping stone to the presidency. And let's just say in this alternate timeline, John Quincy Adams does not choose Henry Clay as Secretary of State. Okay, I do not know who John Quincy Adams would have picked. But without Andrew Jackson, here's the question, because let's just say if that corrupt bargain never happened, would Andrew Jackson have still run for president? Let's just say he did not. And if he did not run for president, would the Democratic Party have existed? The answer is yes, it would have. Because prominent people like John C. Calhoun and Martin Van Buren, who had basically built the Democratic Party on the ideals of states' rights and opposition to tariffs, would have still been opposed by the Adams administration enough to make a new political party. Not to mention, and let's just say if John Quincy Adams had a second term as president, what would have happened? Well, we would have had a national bank, and not to mention, so more power would go to the banking systems. Not to mention, he would most likely continue with his internal improvements. And without Andrew Jackson, the Democratic Party would also have been split, and it would have been a lot less powerful than it was at the time, because the Democratic Party had consisted of all sorts of people. It consisted of people, farmers from the Midwest, and some people from New York and Pennsylvania who had supported tariffs and had also supported the use of the revenue from tariffs for internal improvements. Jackson had avoided taking stances on issues like this because he wanted to keep the party united. And with a figure like Jackson, the party was easily united because people in the West loved him. And Jackson had also supported tariffs and internal improvements to some extent, though not nearly as much as John Quincy Adams. But people in the South, on the other hand, they were strongly opposed to internal improvements as well as tariffs. And John C. Calhoun, he most likely would have been the nominee for the Democratic Party, and he would not have been able to appeal to any area outside the United States South because, first of all, his zealous support of slavery. And by the way, Calhoun was not always a zealous support of slavery. Actually, in his early days, he was much more moderate on the issue, but over time he became more and more radical. And as you can see by this map here, John Quincy Adams would have easily won. Calhoun would have only won the South and Missouri, and any place outside of that, John Quincy Adams would have won. Because really, Jackson was able to appeal to the southern slave owners as well as the Midwestern farmers. And a second Adams term, we would most likely see stuff that he wasn't able to do in his first term, and he most likely would have continued building the roads and his ambitious infrastructure plans. Not to mention the fact that we would have actually gotten that scientific exploration. Jackson had done the same thing in his second term. It would have happened much earlier under Adams. And the national, though we would probably not have had an national observatory and a national university like what Adams wanted. So his most ambitious plans would have most likely still not happened under a second term. And we maybe would have gotten a naval program first if in a second Adams term. And another thing which is quite prominent is that the National Bank will not be removed under John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was a supporter of the National Bank, and the Native American tribes would not be removed from the South either. And the United States federal debt, well, we would not have gotten that slight period in time where our debt was like literally nothing, because without Andrew Jackson was able to control Congress and limit its spending enough to pay off the entire debt. John Quincy Adams, on the other hand, he would have most likely increased the debt more than anything. And since the National Bank would not have been removed, we most likely would not have gotten a recession like we actually did in 1837. And Quincy Adams' his approval, keep in mind, back then they did not have approval ratings, but if they did, John Quincy Adams' approval would have been somewhat steady throughout his terms, not too high, not too low, and Quincy Adams would have been popular enough that Henry Clay would have been elected his successor. And keep in mind, Henry Clay is not Adams' Secretary of State. He runs as Speaker of the House, and he gets the office. Let's just say that. So, one really important thing to understand is that because of Andrew Jackson, the President of the United States got a lot more power than he had before. But under people like Adams and Clay, they had wanted a weaker president and a more powerful Congress. Clay also, he pretty much would have continued Adams' policies, and with regards to the crisis in South Carolina, Clay would have most likely implemented that compromise tariff much earlier, and the crisis would have been averted. And not to mention the fact that he most likely would have really just done what Congress wanted him to do more than anything. Clay really was not really a fan of the president having too much power, and also we might have gotten the National University and the National Observatory. Maybe would have gone the observatory. I don't know about the university though. And as for Indian removal, this would have never happened. Most likely all those Native American tribes would stay in the Deep South. And as for the state of Texas, we would not have annexed it, at least at this point in time, because Henry Clay, he was opposed to going to war with Mexico over Texas, not to mention the fact that he saw slavery being expanded as a really hotly contentious issue, and he wanted to avoid it as much as possible, and the Manifest Destiny idea would not have happened, because Henry Clay, he was all about compromise, and he would not have wanted to expand into areas where it would potentially cause wars with other countries. And pretty much what would happen is we would not have gotten the issues by 1840, which is once Henry Clay's term expires, or the expansion into Texas, the slavery issue, not to mention the issue of Indian removal and the National Bank. So most likely, the entire Southwest as well as Texas would not have ever been annexed, and this was most likely because we would not have gone to war with Mexico, and the Compromise of 1850 would not have happened because number one, Henry Clay wouldn't have been in the Senate if he had been president. Not to mention the fact that without a war with Mexico, we wouldn't have even gotten the territories that caused that controversy. So, so here's the question: without the Compromise of 1850, and would the Civil War have even happened to begin with? Because, and my answer to that question is yes, and it might have even happened earlier than it really did. Because of all the limited expansion, the South would have gotten angry because they couldn't expand further into the Southwest like they wanted to, and they couldn't even expand it to Texas to begin with. Not to mention the fact that the cotton production would have been very low in the South, and the economy would have been just a disaster for this period of time. Not to mention the tariffs would have not been too popular there. So most likely the states of South Carolina and Mississippi, which were the first two states to secede, would have left the Union. I doubt that any other state would have left the Union because every other state only really left the Union because of Abraham Lincoln. Not to mention the fact that Texas would have also joined the Confederacy because the South Carolina and Mississippi would have been willing to let them join the Confederacy. And would the Republican Party have still formed because it was really the Kansas-Nebraska Act that caused the party to form. And in this scenario, it might not have even formed because we would not have gotten, because this is the these were the territories of the United States at the time, and we would not have gone Texas, by the way, nor would we have gone California. We would have gone Oregon, though, and most likely the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as well as the Dred Scott decision, would not have happened, merely because of the fact that all this issue over slavery, or maybe the Dred Scott decision actually would happen because it happened in Missouri, not any of the expanded territories, but the Kansas-Nebraska Act would definitely not happen because by this time the Whigs or the Republicans would most likely be in charge, and this law wouldn't have even passed to begin with. So the issue, though, is that the Whig Party would have probably been divided between Charles Sumner, the abolitionists, and the Cotton Whigs, who were led by Edward Everett, who were more supportive of slavery in the South. So the Democrats and Edward Everett would have most likely joined forces to prevent abolitionists from going too far, and maybe a Democrat could have even gotten elected at this period of time. And yeah, I tried to cut out Texas but yeah, just ignore this piece of land here. But anyway, the Democrats could have possibly won by this point in time. And yeah, ignore South Carolina and Mississippi. That was lazy on my part. But anyway, the Democrats could have possibly won the South at the presidency at this time because many people in the Midwest would have been upset because they were not able to expand farther by the Whigs. And tariffs were also a very contentious issue. And the Democrats, let's just say Stephen Douglas was their nominee, if they were able to stay united over the issues of popular sovereignty and tariffs, then most likely they would have done well in that election. Not to mention the fact that without the Civil War going on the scale that it really did, because if you have only two states to see the Union, they'll most likely rejoin it pretty soon. And not to mention the fact that slavery would have been abolished way later in time because it was really the Civil War that caused the abolition of slavery. And slavery would eventually have to be abolished, at least for once abolitionist movements keep on growing and growing, it would eventually be abolished, at least I hope so. But it would have happened way later in time, and maybe even a civil war in the 1900s to make sure that happened. Not to mention the fact that racial segregation would maybe even still be an issue today. I mean, it still somewhat is, but some areas of the United States would still have those Jim Crow laws, maybe. Not to mention the fact that we would get the southwestern United States way later in time. And the most significant change of all, if Andrew Jackson was never president, is that the power of the presidency is significantly reduced. Because it was really issues like the Civil War and the nullification crisis, as well as the Mexican-American War, that caused the power of the president to increase the way it did. Without Andrew Jackson, this power would not have increased. So overall, you may hate Andrew Jackson, but it's pretty clear that without him, many of the stuff that would have happened, like the civil rights, like, yeah, for Native Americans, it's a good thing if Andrew Jackson was never president, but for slaves, it would have been a terrible thing because their freedom would have come way later. And while many of the controversies at the time would not have happened, it still would have, in the long term, caused a big impact on the United States. And yes, maybe not the biggest impact of all, some of that stuff would have still probably happened. So this isn't the biggest change that could possibly happen, but it still is a pretty significant one. I mean, in terms of the president's power, he today, over time, yes, it would expand, but much later than it really did, because back to what I was saying earlier, it was really the Civil War that caused the president's power to expand the way it did. Without the Civil War growing, at least on that scale, then the power of the president would have been really limited until like the 1900s. So anyway, thank you for watching this video. I hope you liked this video and subscribe. Make sure you check out my next videos and my previous videos, and thanks for watching.